economists since Adam Smith have a missing gene about about nations and about borders, because the theme of so much of economics is that borders are artificial, and it is trade, markets, and global that gives prosperity. And I basically believe that also. So I have a missing gene, I know, in being able to think in strong national terms. Because I really believe that it's when we have open, connected borders and international life that people achieve what they aim to achieve in prosperity. That's not the whole story of life by any means. There is identity, there's culture, there's people's feelings, beliefs, religion, language. I don't want to minimize that. But from an economic point of view, so much of this is self-destructive, because when we divide rather than unify, we almost inevitably crush economic opportunities rather than create economic opportunities. And this comes to a lesson that we haven't talked about of World War I that I want to bring into this discussion about Ukraine, and that is the post-World War I. Maybe it was talked about actually yesterday. I missed it, but I haven't heard it referred to, so I'm going to mention it. Of course, the end of World War I is famous for having made a mess of the post-World War I economy, having created the reparations burden on Germany, having created a breakdown, actually, of what had been spreading trade through Europe and what became completely parcelized and divided Europe, which was a cause of the economic crisis of the 1920s and the Depression and the rise of Hitler to power in the 1930s with the economic disaster. And of course, John Maynard Keynes became famous justly for having written in 1919 in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, the basic insight, which has been disputed but is basically right and remains, that a harsh peace after World War I was a risk of creating a new harsh political environment that could give rise to a regrowth of war. And that unfortunately proved to be the case. So let me fast forward 75 years to the end of the communist period, where I picked up the story personally in 1989. I was asked by the Polish Solidarity movement, and I'm going in 3 days to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the first partially free election in this region, which was June 4th, 1989. I was asked by Solidarity to help them devise an economic strategy. And I was given one sentence as the assignment from Jacek Koran, who asked me to write this document, which I did. He also asked me unfairly to write it overnight in one night, which I also did. And that was the advantage of having had several Harvard all-nighters. Maybe the one training I got that paid off. But he said the first line should be, "This is an economic plan to return to Europe." So the vision of Solidarity was to break the artificial divide of 1945 and to try to create a unified Europe. And I wrote a plan that said, make trade open almost immediately, make the currency convertible, and I said Poland should rejoin Europe, which was then the European Community. I wrote in the document within 5 years, or at the end of 5 years. It took 15 years at the end. But the idea was a quick return to Europe. And I can tell you something very particular, which was that everything I suggested how to stabilize the currency, emergency funding. The IMF and the US government followed almost to the letter and almost instantaneously. And I thought, gee, that's good. This is how it should be. This is going to be the difference of 1919 and 1989. Then I came here, and Mr. Markovic asked me to help end the Yugoslav hyperinflation. And I looked at the data and I said, you know, there is a way to do this. I have an idea. And actually, I had a good idea, which could have worked. And Mr. Markovic made a plan, as many of you will recall, and it went into effect. And then there was no response from the West at all. Simple things like rolling over Yugoslavia's debt proved to be impossible, no interest. It was almost inane, the response from Europe, except Europe didn't want to save Yugoslavia as a country, first of all, and it was already into very particular, this one's on our side, this one's not on our side, and we were beginning to see a very different mentality. I didn't understand that at the time. I just thought they were idiots, frankly, the European side, unresponsive, understanding of a hyperinflation. And what I had learned from Keynes as a practicing economist, and what I believe to this day, is don't let a crisis just fester, because it will turn into a disaster. You actively try to cure things. You don't just let things take their natural course, because natural courses end up in war. They don't end up in solutions. You have to work for solutions. So then I was asked by Mr. Yeltsin, first by Mr. Gorbachev, who I was happy to try to help. That failed miserably when a group of us suggested to Mr. Gorbachev to appeal to the West for emergency financial support. And there was no interest at all at the G8 summit in 1991. And when Gorbachev left the G8 summit, the putsch in August 91 took place, in part because they said, this guy's got nothing. He's, you know, a failure. He can't bring any help to this country. Disaster. 3 months later, Mr. Yeltsin called me. Actually, Mr. Gaidar called me and asked me to help. And I had a lot of experience about financial stabilization at that point, and I wrote up the kinds of things that should be done. And you'll see why this is relevant in just a moment. And they are basic things: a standstill on debt servicing, emergency financial lines, some help with canceling unpayable debts. These are standard solutions for a deep financial crisis. I proposed, as in Poland, a stabilization fund for the ruble. In other words, back the currency. Not one of those things was accepted. Complete smackdown, 100%. Not one of them. I've been blamed for many things for 25 years afterwards, which are absurd, because it wasn't about economics, it was about politics. The West, and especially Washington, was just not interested in helping Russia, period. Russia was on the other side of the divide, mentally. This is something that I failed to appreciate and absolutely could not embody in my own imagination. For me, 1992 was a glorious moment of history, a chance for democracy, a chance for unification, a chance for ending Cold War divisions, a chance for creating a new prosperity. I couldn't imagine that Mr. Cheney, who was then Defense Secretary, and his deputy Wolfowitz and others were dreaming up the new American century and dreaming up how to maintain American unipolarity. But they were. And somebody explained it to me, actually. A senior US official said to me, Jeff, I want you to understand, even if your economics is right, and I'm not saying I disagree with you, you're not going to get any of these requests met. You're just not. Understand it. My problem is I can't hear no very well. Because many times I hear no and it turns into yes, so I never know when no is real or when it's just slowness on the other side. And so I didn't believe this man. He happened to be acting Secretary of State at the time. He knew something about US policy, but he was basically telling me the economics was right, but the politics was wrong. That's what I couldn't dream. I couldn't dream that we wouldn't take this wonderful opportunity to help Russia through a very intense financial crisis, to help it get it back on its feet, and to help create a more unified geopolitical world that didn't have divides in it. Well, nothing like that happened. And Russia went into a very deep financial crisis, not only because of this, because the whole buildup of the Soviet collapse was a mega collapse of a mega wrong economic approach for decades. Let's be clear about that. But there was no help at all from the West. And the Russian crisis was deep, and then the Russian state was completely pillaged by corruption, massive, massive corruption. And when Putin came to power, he could not look at the U.S. in very friendly terms, frankly, because this had been stupid behavior by the United States over this period. Thoughtless, cynical, not designed to solve problems. Not as bad as 1919, but nothing like the enlightened approach that could have cemented a solid relationship. It was a way to create doubt, a way to create animosity, a way to say the U.S. is in charge and we don't care. And I think this is incredibly short-sighted. And I observe this front and center. Here, to some extent, although I couldn't put the pieces together very well, as I said, I just thought it was stupid politics, but it was geopolitics. And in Russia, it was really geopolitics. And in a way, we're living on that legacy. I don't want to absolve the Russian government of what I regard as absolutely unlawful actions in recent months. But the prelude to it was that we lost an opportunity historically that would have made a very big difference by having a magnanimity in 1989, 1991. There was no magnanimity at all. There was just short-sightedness. I can't even tell you, by the way. I mean, I can tell you, but I don't have time to tell you. I went to the IMF and said completely sensible things, knowledgeable things, experienced things, things that have been proven in Poland 2 years earlier. And the deputy managing director just looked at me and said, no. And I said, why? No. Why? Well, you know why he was saying no. He was saying no because the US government told him to say no. Why wasn't he explaining it? Because he couldn't explain it. Because he was just a pawn of the US government at the time. His assignment was to say no. Okay, this is not how we solve world problems. So that's a backdrop to the feelings of recreating divides. And it surprised me that Europe too, Europe made it, maybe for technocratic reasons to some extent, this enormous hurdle to get into the European Union. And that created the divide. You're in, you're on this side, you're on the other side. Russia, of course, no way. We'll talk to you, but the real members are here. And when NATO followed EU membership, it just absolutely just shifted the barrier. This was not thinking. This really was not thinking, and it especially did not create the conditions for a different kind of approach that really could have been the more unified world that we need. Because not only as an economist would I say that these boundaries are dumb, but I would say they're dangerous. They're dangerous in exactly the way we see them, as we see them becoming dangerous right now. When you have sharp boundaries, then the whole question is, which side are you on? Can Ukraine be pried out of Russia's hands into Europe's hands? This is an absurd question. Look at a map. Ukraine can't be pried anywhere. Ukraine is where it is. And it happens to be next to Russia on one side and next to Europe on another side. It's not a matter of prying it out. And look at where Russia is. Russia is the main part of Russia's population is in Europe. And the main part of Russia's economy, other than some of the oil and gas reserves, are in Europe. And by the way, Russia cannot succeed economically without good relations with Europe. When I went to Moscow in January and participated in a very good forum with senior government officials, I felt the situation economically was pretty good, actually, and that the economy was being pretty well managed. But I thought that what was missing was stronger connections between Russian industry and especially German industry to modernize Russian industry in aeronautics, in automobiles, in information technology, because Russia is operating on 1.5 engines right now. One is, of course, the petroeconomy, and the half engine is manufacturing, which isn't quite internationally competitive, but could be. But for that, it needs strong technological connections with Germany above all, with Europe more generally, and with the world, not to be closed. So I left Moscow just before the Olympics feeling pretty good. Just one more step, and we're going to have a way finally to get the economy properly set. Well, you may say that's just my naivete, and there is naivete in it because I'm always hoping for the better. I'm not making forecasts, I'm trying to aim for the better outcome. And then everything was downhill from then on. And I do believe that both sides of this, though I hate to think of them as sides, but of course it's both sides, have responsibility for what's happened. Europe and the United States acted provocatively, I do believe, and pushed in certain ways. So did Russia. I do believe that Russia has international legal responsibilities to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which it has violated, and which I think is a very serious violation. There's quite a solemn commitment made in 1994, in addition to the normal international law, which says that in return of the nuclear weapons from Ukraine, Russia commits to guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And this is fundamental. How are we ever going to get nuclear weapons under control, as Nina said, if we don't honor such commitments in such contexts? So I'm not happy with what's happened. I understand it. But I'm not at all happy or relieved by these tensions. I find them extremely serious and very dangerous, actually. The truth is that none of the big powers right now is respecting international law. And this is the big danger for the whole world. Certainly a big danger for all small countries, but it's actually a big danger for all countries. We can't just choose international law when we want to. I was completely on the Russian and Chinese side, if I may say so, during the debate over Syria. Because to my mind, when the U.S. says Assad must go, that's a violation of international law. I don't like any country saying some other leader must go. We can't have a world like that, where some power dictates who runs another country, much less when that leader doesn't go, that we funnel arms or logistics or money to a rebellion. That's completely in violation of international law. And it continues to this day. And President Obama reconfirmed U.S. Syrian policy just in his speech at West Point a few days ago. And then he proclaimed U.S. commitment to international law. That's a kind of blindness. That is American hubris. It's not really acceptable. It's extremely dangerous. And I completely sided, by the way, with Russia when Russia and China complained about the Libya operation. You know, that really was a case, convince Gaddafi to give up his nuclear and other ambitions and then kill him because they got tired of him. We can't go on actually like this. Every local rebellion, you say, okay, we support you because so-and-so must go, and then send in NATO planes. That's not acceptable. And so I found myself very much on Russia's side on these arguments, but not on Ukraine, because it's the same behavior the other direction, it seems to me. It's no more justified. There's territorial integrity. There's a national commitment. So I don't take sides on these issues. I'm on the side trying, naively as it is, to come to the defense of two propositions. One is that we shouldn't draw artificial economic lines. We should try to make a global world economy because that's going to be the best hope for everybody. And second, that we should honor international law and stop playing games when it's to our convenience or not to our convenience. And not to say, as President Obama did a few days ago, I believe to the core American exceptionalism. Then he said, because we're exceptional and that we defend international law. Well, not quite. Because if you listen to American presidents, all of them, they say, we will always choose our own, not what the UN tells us to do. That's not international law. International law says that except for self-defense, you have to have a Security Council resolution. You don't get to choose. That's our hope for peace. That is the difference of 1914 and what we hope for today. So these are reasons why I regard the Ukraine crisis as very serious and why I really hope that what we're seeing right now is some cooling off now that the presidential election has taken place. An experienced, seasoned Ukrainian politician has been elected president. I think he's making the right statements about seeking a peaceful working relationship with Russia. This strikes me as extremely sensible and correct. And what I do know, again, and I'll close here, speaking with an economist's hat on one more time, Russia cannot gain by this in any way. It's actually not even the case that it's testing whether Germany will or won't follow through on sanctions. That's too superficial a way to understand the dynamics of this. If Ukraine is destabilized, if there were to be a border crossing of Russian troops into eastern Ukraine under any pretext, it doesn't matter right now what the leaders think about sanctions. The breakdown of economic relations will be extraordinary. And Russia's prosperity depends not on signing another deal with China, though that's fine, not on the Eurasian Union, whatever. It depends on Russia being part of the world economy. And it depends on Russia being well integrated with high technology world, not with low technology neighbors, but with a high technology world, because that's Russia's hope for reaching the prosperity that it seeks. And so that's why I hope this crisis is on its waning days now, because it's an extremely dangerous one for all of us, and it's extremely dangerous for Russia as well. I think Serbia's present position is prudent and also compatible with its coming role in the OSCE. just to try to be constructive, but not to take a side in this. And I think that that's clearly what the government is doing, and it seems completely appropriate to me. I did want to answer Nina in one regard, which is that you never know whether taking the option of hoping for the best will work or not. But in general in life, it's better to try that than to presume the failure. And so I think that I'm happy to go through life naively optimistic, because there's a functional approach to that, which is that once in a while you're right and you actually get a good outcome. You surprise a lot of people. Of course you're disappointed. Life is filled with disappointments, but better to be disappointed after having tried the right thing than to be confirmed in your disappointment for not having tried. And I can only tell you, I'll tell you a story that may seem a little bit peculiar also. When Poland first made this transition in 1989, I wrote this plan, and I put forward these ideas that, as I said, were ultimately accepted. But at the first moment, the IMF technical team rejected all of them, and I had a kind of showdown with them in a hotel in Warsaw. And they said, these are the same people as 6 months ago. Nothing's really changed here. Why would you give help to these people? They're the same people that cheated before and defaulted before. And it was a cynical senior bureaucrat, by the way, very nice man. But no, really a very nice man, but basically just doing the normal thing. And I looked at him in disbelief. I said, are you kidding? You're in charge of a region that's just had the biggest geopolitical change in 50 years, and you're saying nothing's changed? Are you kidding? You're not going to try? And believe me, if you don't try, I'm going to blast the hell out of you for failure to try. Not that that makes so much of a difference, but it gives me a little bit of opportunity to release steam. And they ended up, the U.S. had a different point of view and ended up following the ideas of actually doing something. So you may be right. You may be completely right, substantively, that there could not have been a big reform early on, that it wasn't ready. Russia was as difficult and confused as any place I've ever worked in my whole life, which is more than 100 countries. In 1992, it was a terribly difficult circumstance. And of course, I'm no expert in any of this. I'm the worst thing possible. I'm an economist that does not know all of the details, the history, the intricacies of local politics, and so forth. But I do believe that the stance of hope, rather than the stance of resignation or feeling that things must go on, is generally the right approach to take, because life sometimes surprises in a very positive way. And I think we didn't act with hope. I think we acted with maybe realism,
prejudice.
maybe
true.
prejudice, maybe cynicism, because Mr. Cheney's one of the most cynical people that we've ever had in public life in the United States. And that's a serious comment, not just he got us into a disaster globally. And I think that this kind of cynicism is the big danger. And when you look at the history of World War One, which is what has brought us here, we fall into World War One because in the end, every actor took the worst scenario of the counterpart. And this is what leads to disaster in the end. And in that book, which you kindly mentioned, when your grandfather and President Kennedy made peace in 1963, it was precisely because each of them reached beyond their own advisors, who would have killed the world 1,000,000 times over And they actually both said, I can do something with my counterpart, they're human beings. That was a very unusual position to take, by the way. That's why I love that speech of President Kennedy, which I quoted last night, and for those of you who were at the dinner, and for those not, it was a speech on peace that he gave, and it was a unique speech from the point of view of an American president, because the whole speech in 1963, it's unbelievable. Rather than telling the Soviet Union what to do, the whole speech is directed to the American people to urge them to reconsider America's attitudes, because his whole speech is saying the Soviet people are human beings. They want the same things we do. They're not irrational, they're not crazy. Our job is not to humiliate them. They are our counterparts, and our common interests absolutely exceed our divisions. And that was his whole point, to tell Americans, have confidence, we're dealing with human beings on the other side. So I really do think that this is, I mean, it's a stance, it's my ideological stance. Always aim for the best. And if you lose a little money in the process, it's only money in the end. Because I'm never doing anything more than saying put money into it. Because I believe that adding some resources can ease tensions, help people to survive, lower the temperature, create a sense of stability. I'm terrified of mobs, basically. I'm terrified of things running out of control. I'm terrified of panics. I'm terrified of self-fulfilling prophecies, of downward spiral of hate, because all of those things we know are well within the human condition and are absolutely rational from the point of view of any individual actor at any moment, but produce completely disastrous, irrational results. So I'm always in favor of trying the best, and if you fail, okay, what have you done except you've lost a little money along the way, but at least you will have, on the positive side, laid down a marker that says I tried, rather than I was too doubtful to try, never trusted you from the beginning. And that is generally my motivation, just to explain that.